Hey, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the first live stream video that's specifically for pop culture magic. I've decided to do a separate live stream because I noticed that, well, for one thing, I have two different Facebook groups. I have the Pop Culture Magic Facebook group, and then I have the Magical Experiments Facebook group. And what I've really noticed is that the Pop Culture Magic Facebook group has really become its own thing. And so it didn't really make sense to me to continue to do live streams about general magic topics that might not be of interest to people in the pop culture magic group, and vice versa, doing stuff on pop culture magic that might not be of interest to the magical experiments group. So I decided to go the little extra route and set this up. I'm not going to guarantee this will necessarily happen every week. We'll see. Right now we're just going to kind of focus on seeing what happens this week and next week and kind of go from there. So I thought what I would do today is talk a bit about how to pick the pop culture that you want to turn into a spiritual magical system, because I noticed a lot of people have asked that question. It's interesting because when you look at pop culture, there's such a wide variety of pop culture out there that it can be a little overwhelming to figure out, like, what pop culture should I work with? Especially if you're like me, and I assume you are, and you have multiple geeky interests. It's one of those cases where it can get a little overwhelming just in terms of that. And not only that, but maybe you have some pop culture you like for nostalgia's sake. So which do you choose, the modern pop culture or the pop culture that was, say, around 20, 30, 40 years ago, or 10 years ago for that matter? So the thing that I want you to keep in mind is that there's a really important healthy balance that also needs to be kept, in the sense that sometimes it's nice to just enjoy some pop culture without necessarily turning it into a magical system. In fact, I'd say most of the pop culture that I enjoy, I don't necessarily think about it and say, well, what could I'm not necessarily thinking, how can I turn this into a magical system? Sometimes I'm just enjoying the pop culture. So I think that's important. And so when you're looking at your pop culture and you're trying to figure out what you should be using or what you should be drawing on, the thing that I think it's a really good idea to just try and focus on one or two candidates that really speak to you when it comes to the pop culture work. That way you're not overloading yourself trying to go in multiple directions at the same time. Because let's be honest here, if you're developing whether you're developing a one-off pop culture magic working or a pop culture magic system, it can get very easy to get caught up in the shiny object syndrome of, I want to go over to this pop culture instead of that pop culture. I want to focus on all these other different things instead of just sticking with something that I initially got into. And I really recommend focus. Focus yourself on one specific pop culture or two specific pop cultures that you would like to turn into a magical system. That way you're really giving yourself the full attention and time to that pop culture that it deserves, and you're really taking the time to explore that system and flesh it out. And again, I see this with a lot of people where they get into pop culture magic, and it's kind of like, I can go over here, I can go over there, I can go everywhere. And that initial period is perfectly understandable. But that's why you want to eventually settle in on something that really speaks to you. Like in my case, I work with the pop culture magic system Dahara, which is the Wraithu system of magic that Storm Constantine and I developed. So that's one system. I've done a fair amount of work with Harry Potter and still do sometimes. So that's another system. And, so occasionally I draw on some other things, but really I've stayed focused on primarily those systems. And the reason why is because it's allowed me to develop the lore and mythology and the magic from those systems, instead of just getting caught up in the going in multiple directions. Now I will say, and this will seem contradictory, but I will say, if you come across a pop culture where the magical concepts and the ideas and the practices really speak to you, I would tell you that then, definitely consider that as a possible project you could explore. Now, maybe, but the point is that really you want to get focused. Narrow your focus down to just one or two pop cultures that you're going to explore magically, because you only have so much time, for one thing. And if you're really gonna, if you really decide to develop this system of pop culture magic, the thing you have to keep in mind is it requires some dedication on your part. You know, you're choosing to focus on that pop culture and turn it into a viable system of magic. So just keep that in mind. Now, when you're picking your pop culture, you know, it should be about what you like, but it should also be something that you can connect with magically. And what I mean by that is that, you know, there's some pop culture out there where there's really nothing overtly magical about the pop culture, and that doesn't mean you couldn't turn it into a pop culture magic system. It just means you're going to have to work a bit harder, and you're going to have to rely a bit more on traditional magical approaches. Whereas there's some pop culture where they've already taken the time to build magic into their into the pop culture, and as a result, you have something that you can draw on and work with that makes a lot more sense with what you're trying to do. For example, a series that I really liked is The Deathgate Cycle by Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman. You know, they have appendices where they describe how the magic works in that series. That makes that series into a very viable target when it comes to developing a pop culture magic system, because you already have explanations for how magic works in that, and you can take those explanations and mesh it with what you already know about magic from, you know, traditional sources. Whereas on the other hand, let's say you choose something like I don't know, Cowboy Bebop, for example, which is an anime show. I might be dating myself a little bit here, but there you go. There's nothing overtly magical. It's still something that can be worked with. I mean, I ended up developing a little elemental magic, classic 5 elemental magic working that was based off the characters, but you're still having to stretch a little bit. Another example I'll use, Horizon Zero Dawn, which I played a little while back. I was really drawn to the character of Aloy, and I thought it was a fascinating world. But one of the challenges that I found is that as I started to try and figure out, you know, is there a viable way to develop a system of magic, I found there really wasn't, because there isn't anything in that game that really talks about the spirituality or the magical forces. I mean, you see some stuff in relationship to the machines, but it's much more sci-fi. Could I develop a system of magic from it? Sure, I could. It would just take a lot more work, and I had to really evaluate that and decide, was that something I really wanted to commit to along with everything else that I'm focusing on? So that's a good example there of you know, kind of things to think about when you're figuring out what kind of pop culture that you want to draw on. Is, you know, is it something that already has a built-in explanation for how magic works? And if so, is it something that you can work with? And if it doesn't, are you willing to do that extra work to develop that magical explanation as well? Because again, you're going to need to do that if there's not something overt. The other thing to think about with that is that, you know, you want to consider when you're considering what pop culture to pick, is do you even agree with how magic is explained, if magic's explained in the pop culture? For example, I would never use the magical systems from Once Upon a Time, the Disney show that's out. And the reason why is because their number one rule is that you know, whenever you do magic, there's always a price you pay. I don't like the price that the characters pay in that particular show. So it's kind of like, do I really want to work with that as a system? Some people would, and that's okay. I mean, you can do that if you want to, but it's really important to take a step back and take an analytical look at things like that. So the other thing that I'm going to talk about, and this is kind of the hard truth time here about developing your pop culture magic system, is that it is important to draw on a well-rounded foundation. What I mean by that is, you know, if you have ideally already started practicing magic for a while, and you have some experience with classic or traditional approaches to magic, you know, some people are like, well, can I just, you know, do pop culture magic on the fly? And I personally don't think it's possible. And yes, people will say, but you're into magical experimentation. And my answer to that is, I am into magical experimentation, but I've also done a ton of research, and I've learned a lot of stuff, and I can tell you that experimentation does not occur unless you have a well-rounded foundation in place that supports what you're doing. And this is what I find for a lot of people is they just kind of want to skip right to the pop culture magic without necessarily developing that well-rounded understanding. And hey, I get it. I mean, pop culture magic is fun. But if you look at pop culture magic, it does require a fundamental understanding of magic and how magic works. And that's not something that you're going to just, it's not something you're just going to learn, without actually taking some time to learn some classic or traditional approaches to magic. Of course, if you want help with that, you can check out, and I have it in the links to the description, you can check out the Magical Experiments University, where I offer a number of courses on magic. And we'll be offering a course on pop culture magic systems. So keep that in mind. But I think that, a well-rounded foundation is something that kind of gives you some experiences with magic in and of itself and helps you to take a look at those experiences and add them into your pop culture magic. It teaches you to also think about, well, what do I need to draw on from the pop culture in order to make it viable? And what do I need to draw on from what I know about magic in order to make it viable? Otherwise, it just becomes so much fantasy in our heads. And, as fun as that can be, it's not the same thing. We don't want wish fulfillment when it comes to our magic. We want to be able to get practical results. We want to develop deeper connections with the pop culture spirits we're working with. And that doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because you've done the work. You've spent the time learning how magic works, and you're able to take, something that you've learned that's more classic, and you strip out the stuff that, doesn't necessarily work for you and replace it with the pop culture stuff and make it work. And that's a huge part of how I approach pop culture magic, but it happened because I spent that time doing that work. So I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at pop culture magic work and how you set stuff up. Now, I don't say that to discourage you from developing your pop culture magic. I mean, if you got some great ideas, great, but just keep in mind you do need to do the research and the work, and that's just true of anything in life. I mean, as hard as it may be to hear that, it's just the simple hard truth. So what I want you to kind of take away from this at this point is that, A, if you're into pop culture magic and you're watching this and you're not part of the pop culture Facebook group, go and join that. And B, if you want to understand how magic works in general, then check out the Magical Experiments University. And finally, when you're looking to develop your pop culture magic system, remember that you want to focus on just one or two candidates for possible pop culture magic work. Don't get too scattered, especially if you want to develop a system. And when you're picking out pop culture, you want to see if there's already some ideas or thoughts on the metaphysics of magic in the pop culture thing, but you also want to be able to draw on what your own practical, hard-won experience when it comes to magical work. Okay, that's it. If you guys have any questions, of course, you can comment and I will respond to them. And I want to thank the people who watched this live, and we'll look at coming back next week. We'll see what happens. So take care, talk soon, and catch you later.